It was just another ordinary evening at a high-end restaurant in New York. The rich, the powerful, and the elite gathered at their favorite spot, laughing and enjoying the night. But one incident, a seemingly harmless comment, would soon escalate into something none of them expected. A Chinese billionaire, surrounded by his entourage, took a jab at a humble black waiter, mocking him for his accent, his appearance, and his job. The laughter from the table echoed across the room, and the entire restaurant joined in. But what happened next left them all speechless. The waiter, with a calmness that stunned everyone, responded in flawless Chinese. And that's when the true power of this moment became clear. James had worked at this prestigious restaurant for over 5 years. A young black man, he'd always dreamed of being somewhere else. Somewhere far from the judgmental eyes that often made him feel like he didn't belong. Yet every day he put on his uniform, smiled, and carried on with the job that paid the bills. He was used to the sneers, the snickers, and the occasional degrading comment from customers who believed their wealth entitled them to anything, even disrespect. Tonight, however, was different. The restaurant was packed, buzzing with excitement. As the grand opening of a new wine collection was underway, the air was thick with tension as high-profile guests filled the space, their conversations a mix of business deals and personal boasts. James was used to serving such individuals, but tonight there was a particular group that caught his attention. A Chinese billionaire named Mr. Lin, with a reputation for being ruthless in business, had just entered with a few of his associates. His presence was commanding, and his entourage, composed of the most well-dressed and confident individuals, seemed to make everyone else pale in comparison. James approached their table, taking a deep breath as he greeted them with his usual professionalism. But Mr. Lin, with a smirk, wasted no time in making his presence known. "You must be new here," he said, his tone condescending. "How long have you been a waiter? I can hardly imagine someone of your background in such a high-class establishment." Laughter rippled through the table. James could feel the heat rising in his cheeks, but he kept his calm. He had dealt with worse. As he began to take their orders, Mr. Lin continued, mocking his accent, throwing jabs about his race. The laughter grew louder, and for a moment it seemed like the whole room was in on the joke. But James wasn't going to let this pass. He knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed. After all, it wasn't just about his pride. It was about something bigger. James turned to leave the table, his mind racing. He had always maintained his professionalism, even in the face of mockery. But tonight, something felt different. His hands tightened around the notepad as he walked away, the weight of the laughter still echoing in his ears. As he reached the kitchen, he paused, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He could feel the eyes of his co-workers on him, their sympathetic glances following his every move. But James wasn't the kind of person to show weakness, not in front of anyone. Minutes later, as he returned to the table to serve their drinks, he noticed Mr. Lin looking at him again, his gaze more calculating this time. "You know," Mr. Lin said, his voice dripping with arrogance, "in my country we don't tolerate people who don't know their place. You should be grateful for a job like this. But I suppose that's the problem with people like you, isn't it? You don't know where you belong." James felt the sting of the words, but he refused to let his emotions show. He stood there, silent for a moment, collecting his thoughts. His heart raced, not with anger, but with a deep, unshakable sense of injustice. Mr. Lin wasn't just mocking him. He was mocking everything James represented. His ancestors, his culture, his hard work, and the very idea that someone like him could ever rise above his station. But James wasn't about to let that happen. He looked Mr. Lin directly in the eyes and said, "Actually, I know exactly where I belong, and I belong here. Just as much as you do." The room fell silent. Everyone at the table paused, unsure of how to react. For a moment, James thought that maybe he had said something wrong. But then, in a flash of resolve, he smiled, his eyes narrowing. With purpose. I also know something else, James continued. I know that some people think they can insult others based on where they come from, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it. I don't know why you think your wealth and status make you superior to anyone, but I'll tell you this. You're about to find out just how wrong you are. The silence stretched on as James turned to walk away. The other customers at the restaurant watched, some with confusion, others with intrigue. But James didn't care anymore. He had made his point. And now it was time for Mr. Lin to face the consequences of his words. James walked to the back of the restaurant, his pulse still racing. He could feel the stares of the other staff members, their eyes wide with anticipation. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about standing up for every person who had ever been ridiculed or belittled because of their race, their accent, or their background. He couldn't let this go. He made his way to the kitchen, grabbed a towel, and wiped his face. He needed to be calm, but he also needed to do something that would change the atmosphere in that room, something that would show Mr. Lin and the others that their privilege didn't make them untouchable. James wasn't just some waiter. He was someone who had learned to survive through adversity, who had honed his mind and skills through his experiences. And tonight, he would turn the tables. The other staff members watched him curiously, but James barely noticed them. As he approached the table once again, he could feel the eyes of the room on him. The rich chatter had died down, replaced by a nervous energy that made the tension in the air palpable. Mr. Lin, James said, his voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of something stronger, something that made everyone else in the room lean in. I know you're used to being in control, but what you just said was wrong, and I think it's time I showed you why. There was a brief pause before James took a deep breath, his gaze now locked with Mr. Lin's. The billionaire, still oblivious to what was coming, raised an eyebrow and chuckled, clearly unbothered. Go on then, Mr. Lin said, still full of himself. Show me what you've got. James didn't flinch. He straightened up, focused, and in that instant, he made his move. 你觉得你在这里可以随便嘲笑别人吗? He asked, his voice calm but firm. The Chinese words flowed easily from his tongue, perfect, fluent, and commanding. For a split second, the entire room went silent. Mr. Lin's eyes widened in disbelief, his face losing all the arrogance it had held moments before. The mocking laughter that had filled the room now seemed to dissipate, replaced by an awkward silence. James's words echoed in the air, and they carried weight far beyond their meaning. What had just happened wasn't just a reversal of the power. Dynamic, it was a statement, a clear reminder that no matter who you were or where you came from, your assumptions and prejudices didn't define the worth of others. The billionaire's smirk faded. He didn't understand the language, but he knew exactly what James had said. His confidence, once overflowing, began to shrink as the reality of his actions sank in. The room waited for his response, but the laughter that had once been so loud now felt distant and hollow. James stood there, his heart still pounding, but with a sense of calm determination settling over him. He had spoken out, and now the silence that followed felt more powerful than any word he could have said. Mr. Lin stood there, motionless. The smugness had completely disappeared from his face. For the first time that night, he was not in control. The silence that followed James's words seemed to stretch on endlessly, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. The other guests at the table exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to do or say. But the damage had already been done, and for Mr. Lin, the reality of his ignorance was now glaringly obvious. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The confidence he had shown earlier was completely gone. Instead, he simply nodded awkwardly, his face flushed with embarrassment. The billionaire's entourage, who had once joined in the laughter, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to belittle James. James stood tall, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. He hadn't needed to shout or get angry. His calm, composed response had done the work for him. The power of words, his words, had shifted the entire atmosphere, and for a moment, the entire room was forced to reflect on their own assumptions and biases. Mr. Lin, now defeated, turned his gaze toward the rest of the room, as though seeking some form of validation. But all he met were the eyes of people who had witnessed the unraveling of his arrogance. There was no applause, no cheers, just the heavy stillness of a moment where the truth had been laid bare. James, though still feeling the weight of the encounter, felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about one man. It wasn't even just about him. It was about every single person who had ever been made to feel less than because of their race, their accent, or their background. It was a reminder that, sometimes, all it takes to break the cycle of hate and ignorance is one person standing up for what's right. As James walked away, the whispers of the room slowly began to rise again, but this time the tone had changed. People no longer laughed at the waiter. They were in awe of him. They had witnessed a shift in power, a quiet revolution in a single moment. And as James returned to his duties, he felt a quiet sense of pride. Not because he had won, but because he had made a difference in the only way that truly mattered, by speaking his truth. And as the night wore on, no one would forget the black waiter who had stood up to a Chinese billionaire and, in doing so, had reminded them all of the power that comes with respect, dignity, and standing up against injustice. Takeaway. In moments like these, where racism and prejudice rear their ugly heads, it's easy to feel powerless. But one person, armed with the courage to speak out, can shift the tides. James's response wasn't just about proving Mr. Lin wrong. It was a message to everyone who had ever felt small, a reminder that no matter your race, your background, or your job, you are worthy of respect. You have a voice, and it matters. So next time you encounter racism or any form of injustice, ask yourself, will you stand by or will you speak up?